So I will send out an announcement with, reminding you that those are posted in EduCap. So 2 assignments so far, and then an extra credit will be posted as well. The extra credit I'll probably make due on the weekend before finals so that I can go in and reveal the right answer so you can use it as a study tool for the final exam. Okay. And then the seedless vascular plant, I'll do that with the seedless vascular plant assignment as well as the gymnosperm, because those questions or the flavors of those questions will show up on the final. Okay. So this week I'll talk about other types of gymnosperms today, and then on Thursday we'll get into angiosperms, and that's kind of the last topic. We'll get into angiosperms and flowers and fruits, and that will wrap up the rest of the semester. So can't believe we're that far already. Here you've seen something like this, I think, and so we're zooming into, we've pretty much covered what I'm going to say with regard to life cycles now. So the only life cycle you need to know in the gymnosperms is the Pinus example that we gave you, and as well as the timing. So in the first slide set, we looked at the life cycle, went into pretty good depth on that, and then looked at how in reality the timing is quite long, about 18 months on average. And so, but that's it for the life cycle of gymnosperms. Okay. But now I also wanted to mention these other groups, the cycads, the ginkgo, and the cnidophytes, and explain a little bit about them. So you've seen this already. Looking at the cnidophytes on here and the cycads, they've really, far less species present. Cnidophytes, there's less species present currently. Ginkgo, far less present. So we will be looking at those. Oh, before we get into those though, I did need to say a little about pine needle, just because I think a lot of people don't understand. When you are looking, if you're out hiking around and you see a baby conifer, they won't look like that when they get bigger in the sense of how many needles they have. So if you've taken maybe BI 112, maybe you did a tree lab where you would look at how many needles are clustered together, and that's a way to identify what kind of conifer you're looking at. But when they're first born, so to speak, when that sporophyte is germinating and growing, they all just have single needles. So it's really hard when they're really, really tiny, really young. It's hard to tell what species they are. And so here you're just looking at very young seedlings, before they're about 2 years old. They just have a single needle on the branches. And then eventually, roughly 2 years into their life, they'll start to grow needles in clusters or bunches. And so the fancy word for that is fascicle, which is shown there in the lower picture. And so a fascicle is this bundling of the needles. And depending on the species, you'll see in this case, there's 2 needles in the bundle. So technically, also, we say needles. I tend to say that over leaves because technically pine needles are branch tissue and not leaf tissue. So that technically, all right. So I tend to say needles in place of the word leaves, but here you can see that now they're growing. When the needles are being formed, they're growing in bunches. And so if you open up a field guide of conifers, that's one thing they'll ask you to look at. How many needles are in the bundle or in the fascia? And then you count that up. And needles, as you know from experience, if you've been around a lot of conifer species, they tend to retain their needles. They're evergreen through the winter. That doesn't mean to say that they never drop their needles. Obviously, they do. If you've been out hiking around, you've seen brown needles on the forest floor. And so, yes, they drop their needles, but not all at once. And so they will drop a percentage over time. So when you look at the overall tree, it still looks, evergreen, but appreciate that they are dropping their needles. However, most needles, they are long-lived. They don't drop them every season. And so depending on the species, they can keep their needles for over 40 years before they get dropped. So it just depends on the species that you're looking at. But that means if they're keeping their needles for that length, a lot of issues can arise, right? So if they experience drought or freezing, pollution events, that can accumulate and cause accumulated damage. And so they have noticed that, for example, in the Black Forest over in Germany, that was one of the first sites in the world where they were picking up the concept of acid precipitation and seeing the damage it was doing as they flew over the Black Forest. This is a bunch of evergreens. They could see the browning going on as the needles were on the tree, and massive amounts of browning of the needles, death of the needles due to acid precipitation. So here you're just looking at a cross section of a needle and the general design when you look at it under the microscope, where you'll see typically two vascular bundles of xylem and phloem. You'll see recessed stomata, so they're sunken down a little bit. And then you often see resin ducts too, where there'll be resin buildup to help protect the needles from grazing and herbivores. So here, again, you're looking at a real microscope image now. And on the left, these are 3 pine needles. So it's in a bundle, a fascicle of 3. All right. And then I've zoomed in over here on the right to just one of those needles in cross section. And so you can see the xylem are the big red cells, and then the phloem are the more delicate bluish cells that you see. And you can see the sunken stomata a little bit here. Okay, and so they don't have stomatal crypts like what we saw in some other leaf designs, but the stomata is recessed enough to slow down loss of water, transpiration. They're slowing down the transpiration process of the water exiting out of the leaf or the needle. So with the gymnosperms, currently there's about 720 living species. And the phylum Pinophyta, some people refer to them as Chionectrophyta, but I think your book uses Pinophyta, so we'll go with that one. And if you look at that phylum, there are about 550 species. So they're of the gymnosperms, this phylum is the biggest for sure, most successful in terms of currently who's living, who's made it this far in the evolutionary process. The Pinophyta phylum wins. And if you look at the Pinus genus, that's the life cycle I want you to know, the Pinus genus, there's about 90 different species. So, and then all the other 3 phyla of plants will add it up to about 720. But you can see that, Pinophyta is 550 species out of a total of 720 gymnosperm species. So they really dominate the gymnosperms. That's why we tend to focus on them quite a bit and go in more in depth with them. All right, so some of the other groups. So phylum Psychodiophyta are the cycads. There's really only about 140 species of these currently. Here you're seeing some images of how they tend to look here in Florida. That's one of the native sites in Florida. And often you'll see cycads as like living fences, because they grow pretty thickly. You can see though with the close-up of their leaves, they kind of look like palm plants, palm trees or palm bushes, but they're truly in the gymnosperm category. And so, but it's easy to see why people might say there's some kind of dwarf palm tree, but really they're not in the angiosperms, they're a gymnosperm. And so their native habitats are tropical and subtropical. And if you talk to a plant evolutionary biologists, instead of when they go back in time and start talking about when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, instead of saying that was the age of the dinosaurs, a plant person would actually say that was the age of cycads, because it was during that time period cycads were really dominating, really evident, lots of success during that period. But when the dinosaurs went extinct, pretty much a lot of other life went extinct or close to it as well. Here, depending on who you talk to, they'll say in the United States, it's Zamia pumila. Some people say, no, it's Zamia integrifolia. You don't need to know those names. Just be aware that that's, one of those, however you want to call it, or classify it. That's the only one that we know of that's native to the United States, and Florida is where you find them. Okay, so cycads are interesting. You can buy potted cycads for your apartment or home. They're really quite striking. Here you're seeing some more like tree-like cycads being shown here. And so you have to go tropical if you want this. You want to see that kind of stuff. So it's really easy to see why someone say, oh, look at that weird palm tree. But these are truly cycads. They're gymnosperms. So dioecious, remember now that term means that there's, that means two houses. Aecious means house, two. And so dioecious means there's a female cycad plant, and then there's a separate male cycad, right? And one thing to be aware of is that they can produce very potent secondary metabolites. So if you buy a potted cycad to have in your home, you shouldn't have that around pets or young children because it's a neurotoxin. So this is serious stuff. So when I had potted cycads, I only had them in my office where there was no pets or kids to grab at them and try to chew on them. They also, excuse me, hang out with cyanobacteria. So in this picture, I'm cyanobacteria that they tend to be in the root tissue and hang out. And so they are studied for a lot of the like neurotoxin capabilities, some of their secondary metabolites, and some of the interesting interactions that they have with the cyanobacteria. But just, they're used in landscaping a lot because they're very striking. And especially if you live in a tropical area, they're quite beautiful and a unique addition to the landscape for sure. Here they even have a peacock roaming the grounds, but a nice cluster of cycads there. So very, very pretty. Here you're looking at the female cone, kind of looking down on it. And if you have a potted cycad, so the male cone is larger, so that's the right picture. Male cone is usually taller. Female cones are on the left here. Female cones tend to be wider, but squatter, shorter. And if you weigh them, the male cone outweighs the female. So that's an exception. All the other gymnosperms, it's the opposite. The female cone is bigger and weighs more. So one thing about the cycads, it does seem like insects are pretty important in getting the pollination to occur. So you have to get the pollen from the male cycad plant to the female, and they can be spaced apart, of course. Wind certainly plays a role, but they've also seen insects like covered in pollen, and then they'll go to the female cycad and pollen gets deposited. So again, this is kind of getting at the idea that we'll talk a lot about with the angiosperm, where during pollination, it's not wind that is the main way to pollinate, it's use of other animals to pollinate. So here again, just a close up, the male cone on the far left, a female cone next to it, and then a close up of the leaves. Very palm-like, very commonly used in landscaping. I just pulled this picture. This is an herbarium in Mexico. They have a really big herbarium, but I could see that they have cycads all over the place. Very hardy plants, so they're good for landscaping in particular. So cycads, that's in one of the groups. So this one is really weird because if you didn't know any better, again, you say, oh, this is an angiosperm. Phylum Ginkgophyta, or the maidenhair tree. That one, there's only one left. We only see Ginkgo biloba, unless somebody stumbles on one in the deep forest and discovers a new species. This is the only one we know of. So Ginkgo biloba is the only living member, and so all the others have gone extinct. The leaves look very fan-shaped. They're very broad and delicate. Quite nice design. The overall tree usually gets to about 30 meters in height, so they're fairly tall. They are slow growing. They're not very rapid, that's for sure. And another weird thing is they're deciduous. So I just got done telling you that needles get retained on the leaves of conifers. Ginkgo, on the other hand, has the strategy of dropping their leaves in the fall. That's kind of weird. They're useful for the landscaping along city streets and in parks, especially bigger cities, because they're pretty resistant to air pollution and they're very beautiful. So it's a favorite. You have to be careful though. You should only pick the male tree, really, especially if you're planting it in areas that's heavily populated with people walking around that tree a lot. Because what happens is the ovules, when the female tree is producing the ovules and getting ready for sexual reproduction, they give off an odor that can be quite strong. To our nose, it's rancid. It smells like rancid substances, food, and so it's not very pleasant. I once read a blurb, can't think of it, I was at a conference, and there was like a fun fact section in the day, and the fun fact was, they didn't name the person, but there's a city botanist who made the mistake of ordering like dozens of ginkgo biloba and made the mistake of ordering female trees, and they didn't realize it till the trees were planted and got into sexual phase of their life, and oh, it was not good. I don't think the person got fired for that, but I'm sure he had to figure out a way to deal with that. Well, maybe there's some other organism that's involved in pollination, because and so that begs the question, maybe insects are involved in this too. And I can't find, I'll do another search. The last time I looked, which was a year or two ago, I didn't see anything on that that I could lay my hands on. But to me, that's makes sense, right? Some people like to eat it. In Japan and China, it's actually considered a delicacy if you can get past the smell. And there are some foods like that. Like I'm have a Finnish heritage, and there's a famous fish, the way you cook fish in lye. They actually, oh, you did? And it smells awful. My mom would have to cook it for my grandfather on holidays, and oh, when we got old enough, we were over 21, like, let's go to the car, because it smells so bad. Lippiakala, I think, is the Finnish version of how you say it. But they boil it in a solution of lye. That's what you make soap with. It's just, to me, it's good. And it smells awful, but if you taste it, not so bad, not so bad. It has a very mild taste. So I actually finally tasted it, and it's like, oh, this isn't nearly as bad. So maybe that might be the case here, where maybe if you can get past the taste, it has a good fish taste. I don't know. I haven't tried it myself. So here is the female ovule. Very simple. It's not a cone like what we've been talking about, but beautiful leaves. You can see the trees can get very majestic, and so I can see why they do enjoy having those in landscaping. The pollen cones are much smaller on the left here. They look more like a cone compared to, this is not really a cone that you're seeing on the right. So this, when it starts to look like this, the seed has already formed inside, and that's when it starts to get really stinky to our nose. And so when they've looked at how, I'll look in to see if insects are involved in the pollination of that at all, but they've looked into, and this I'm not going to ask you about, but they do their version of sperm delivery a little differently. It's a little bit more complicated, I guess, than when I talked to you in the Pinus. So they've been looking at that, but I couldn't find anything, a year or two ago on pollinating. I'll have to look for that. Okay, and then the last group, Neophytes, phylum Neophyta. There's only 3 genera left. So again, lots have gone extinct. So the genus, the first word there, Nidum, the G is silent. Nidum, Ephedra, that might sound familiar to some of you. And then Welwitschia. And so within those 3 genera, there's 71 different species. And so you're seeing representative pictures of each. So Ephedra is a very nondescript bush-like plant. And that's where they get ephedra from, which is a drug that you can take. I think, wasn't it used for weight loss? I think at one point it was advertised for weight loss. This was years ago, maybe even before you were born. And then they had to ban it because people would take it and it would cause really rapid heart rate. And some people would had heart attacks while taking it. And so they banned it. And I don't even know if any of it is allowed to be sold anymore. But I guess the weight loss was your heart beats so fast, you start shedding calories faster. I don't know. Who knows, but they had to ban it. So Needham, again in the middle, they have more broad looking leaves. You'll look at that more close up. And then, Welwitschia looks like a massive, I don't know, it looks like a mess. So let's look at these. Here's Needham, where their leaves are more broad. They're very tough and leathery. They're amazingly tough leaves. You can see again the female parts very simple in the ovules there. And they have separate, they have a female plant and then a separate male plant, or dioecious. And the male is over here on the right. Doesn't look like much of anything here for where the pollen is getting produced. But their leaves are more, and again, you look at that and go, oh, that looks like an angiosperm. But it's in the gymnosperm category. Here, very shrub-like, no obvious leaves, just stem tissue. These are the ephedra. Mormon tea, you might have heard it called that. The leaves are very, very tiny. I'll show you a close-up in a minute. We don't have them around here. They tend to be in the Southwest in the United States. And they can either be one house, monoecious, where the male and female parts are on one plant, one shrub, or they, depending on the species, they might split it and have separate male and female shrubs. But they're all pretty much shrub-like like this. Stems are what are doing the photosynthesis. Here you're looking at pollen cones, and again, you just see green stems. There's not much to the leaves. The leaves are very thin and dry and scale-like. Here are some of the female cones, so to speak. Again, they don't look too much like cones, but kinda. So ephedra. And then, Welwitschia is really bizarre looking. It starts out like what you see in the lower left, 2 big strappy leaves. That's how it starts out. And then what happens is these leaves start to shred over time, and you get more of a tangled mass like this. And it's found in extreme desert conditions. So as far as I know, the Namib Desert might be the only place that they're left. I'd have to double check that. But the Namib Desert is far south of Africa. Extreme heat, extreme drought. So most of their body is essentially buried in soil, and it's just the leaves that will be up on the surface. And they will send off the cone tissue off the edge of the stem. There's a little bit of the stem protruding out of the soil or the sand. And so they'll send off the branches that will have the cones right there. But kind of a mess. When they're young, they look pretty cool, but then they get this tangled mass. Let me see if I have, here's another picture. So kind of bizarre looking, but that strategy works. Let me show you a close-up of the cones. So the left is the pollen cone, where they're going to form the microspores, and then eventually the pollen will develop from that. And then on the left, you see the larger megasporangium tissue, which is going to be, the gametophyte will form in there. And so dioecious means that there's two separate species, or plants. So you'll have a male plant and a female plant. Here, this one, they captured a lizard of some sort hanging out. This is the female. So it looks like the lizard is waiting for some possible insects to come along. Chameleon, I should say. Okay, so the Cnidophytes, it's kind of weird to think that these three that I just talked about, they're all in the same phylum, even though they look so vastly different from each other. This phylum in general, there's some things to say about them that are notable. This one in particular, this phylum has many plants that exhibit features like angiosperms. And so it got plant biologists thinking maybe the angiosperms evolved from the Cnidophytes. And so that was a hypothesis that they were trying to find data to support for quite some time. Now they've backed off from that, and they're saying, no, the angiosperms probably didn't evolve from them, but they probably had a common ancestor where they diverged off from it. And so if you look into the Cnidophytes, they actually have vessels as part of their xylem tissue. And so far, I've told you, no, there aren't any vessels in the gymnosperm. This is the notable exception. And so the Cnidophytes have what look like vessels, which are the bigger xylem tissue. And we see vessels in the angiosperms, but none of the other vascular plants except for these Cnidophytes. Okay, so they're the exception. We see the absence of archegonia tissue where the egg is. There's an egg, there's still an egg, but it's not contained in this special archegonia tissue in Needham and Welwitschia. And again, we're going to see in the angiosperms that there isn't a true archegonium tissue. So, and so I've asterisked those two points, and then in the subheading here, those two traits were probably independently derived. So they no longer think that the Cnidophytes were the forerunner of the angiosperms. They don't think that anymore. They evolved from some common ancestor before them. And some of the species have strobili, that kind of do look like flower clusters in angiosperms. So we're going to flower 2, and there's a type of flower called an inflorescence, which is just many little flowers all clustered together. And that's kind of what we've been talking about with strobili. We say it's a bunch of sporangium all clustered together. And so there are some Cnidophytes that have a bunch of sporangium all clustered together, kind of looks like a flower. And so again, really makes you think. And then this is also one sperm. When we look at the gymnosperms, I've told you so far, one sperm fertilizes the egg, the other one dies. Well, here's an exception. With the Cnidophytes, one sperm does fertilize the egg, and then the other one fuses with a different cell, but you don't get any kind of endosperm from that. And this will make sense when we get into the angiosperms, because we're going to see with the angiosperms, it's the second sperm doing its job will give rise to the endosperm. Okay, so it's kind of similar to what we see in the angiosperms, but so all of these kind of get you you know, the plant biologists got excited, like, oh, you know, maybe these neophytes, the angiosperms came from them, but now they're saying, no, there's enough differences. They do see insect pollination, as I mentioned, in some of the neophytes, but wind is still very, very important. And so of all the gymnosperms, they do say that the neophytes are more closely related to the angiosperms than the other three phyla. They do say that. But they say there's probably a common ancestor that gave rise to the neophytes and then the angiosperms. Okay, so let me pull up this next phylogenetic tree. So here, if you look on this phylogenetic tree, you can see the Welwitschia, Needham, and Ephedra are on the line right before it shoots off to the angiosperms. So that's telling you that the neophytes are more closely related to the angiosperms compared to the other three phyla, right? And then they're even pointing down here, they're saying, this is where we think there was a common ancestor. And then from that, you get the neophytes branching off and then the angiosperms branching off. So the neophytes are kind of a special group or phylum within the gymnosperm. Okay, the last slide is the table again, where you're looking at the phylum names. So please know the 4 phylum names. Pinophyta, I think, is actually how your book refers to it, not Coniferaphida. I forgot to type that in. I'll have to amend that. So this is kind of one-stop shopping here again, where you can see and compare. So you can see the neophytes, there's trachids and vessels showing up in that group instead of just trachids for their xylem tissue. Okay. You don't need to know. So, you know, the first column, the second column, the third column is important. The fourth column too, not so much. Fourth and fifth column, no. Type of leaves produced, yes, those are just kind of getting into the general characteristics of the 4 phyla. And then this last column, a lot of it's asking, are they monoecious or dioecious really? So I'm not too concerned about this last column. It's more of the previous PowerPoint slide where I say, you know, you have to know what monoecious means and what dioecious means in general, just in general. And the reason for that is when we get into the angiosperms, that's going to show up again and we'll be comparing. Okay. Any questions on the rest of the gymnosperms besides the phylum Pinophyta? Has anyone seen any potted cycad plants for sale? I haven't seen that. Sometimes Lowe's or Menards, maybe they will now with spring around the corner, but essentially it's like a dwarf. It's kind of like a dwarf tree. It looks like a dwarf cycad tree in a pot. They're really cute looking. You just have to be careful not to let your kids around it or your pets. Do I have angiosperms up in Educat? Okay, so that is actually the next thing we're going to get into. So let me get out of this one. Okay, so the last group of plants of the semester are the angiosperms. So now we're getting into the true flowering plants. And This is the monster flower. It's a Rafflesia genus. Found, this one's in Borneo. You have to travel to Borneo to find it. So very odd looking flower and very dramatic. But usually when I say flower, we're thinking a little bit more of the typical, lily flower, rose, or whatever. So here what you're looking at are comparison of how do gymnosperms do it versus how do angiosperms do it. So this is kind of a nice compare and contrast where, we've been talking about this idea of you have a female cone and a male cone. You'll get those, the sporangium tissue has the megaspore mother cell in one, and then that one goes through meiosis to produce spore cells, 3 die off. You get that functional megaspore, which divides, and grows into the megagametophyte. So here you see the megagametophyte showing up, and if everything goes okay, you'll have the pollen cones producing pollen, fertilization, and then you'll get, hopefully, 2 seeds going up of each scale. So they're naked seeds because they're just sitting on top of the scale of the cone. Angiosperms, on the other hand, they are looking at this strategy of a flower. And we're going to learn that flowers can have both male female parts in one flower, or maybe they're going to separate that out into 2 different flowers. It depends on what plant you're looking at. But you need to get the pollen to the female part of the flower and then get the sperm delivered to the egg. So we're still going to talk about ovules, just like what we did with the Pinus life cycle. And then you can see that after fertilization happens and that the seeds are starting to develop, at that same time, you'll have to get fruit. And depending on the species, here they're showing in orange. So oranges, of course, are bright orange in color when they're ready to go, and they're attractive to visual organisms like us that want to come along and eat it and eat the seeds, and then the seeds get deposited out somewhere else, hopefully away from the mother tree, and get growing. So very different strategies, and we need to think about the flower. So you're going to see this in lab as well on Thursday. Pretty much every part on here, I need you to know the anatomy of a flower, except these bottom 2. So the peduncle term, I don't really care that you know that. And the perianth term, you don't need to know that. Okay, but everything else, please. So when this artist who drew this, drew what we call a perfect flower. A perfect flower has both male and female in one flower. And usually when you look at how flowers are designed, what you see is that the female portion of the flower is in the center and the male components surround it. So think about, the males are protecting the female, right? And so that tends to be the strategy if you have a perfect flower. Female in the center, males surrounding. So the female part is the stigma, style, and ovary. And the way I remembered that is my dad would often tease my sister and I and say, you women, you're such enigmas. An enigma rhymes with stigma. And so that, for some reason, just stuck in my head when I must have been learning flowers when he was teasing us. So stigma is the top portion here. This is where the pollen is going to land. Style, I remember that because women have style. And then ovary, of course, women have ovaries. So stigma, style, and ovary. So the style is used to raise up the stigma. It's like a stalk so that the stigma can be raised up above the other flower parts, hopefully where pollen will easily get there. And we're going to zoom into the ovary because it's inside the ovary that you're going to have maybe 1 ovule or maybe more. This artist drew 6 ovules in this ovary. So we'll definitely look at that. So that's the female part. If you take all 3 of those together, then you say carpel. I tend to favor pistil because, again, my dad would often say that to me when I get sassy, not mean sassy, but if I'd sass a little bit. and say, oh, you're such a pistil. And again, that just stuck with me. So pistil or carpel is including all of those parts when you say that word. The male parts, the anther, again, I remember that because if you just take the H out and put an L, it's antler. And I think about male deer. So the anther is for pollen being produced eventually. And then the filament, I think about fishing line filament and going fishing with my dad. So filament, that stuck with me. And then stamen is if you can do both together, and the word men is right in there. And so stamen is the male part of the flower, which includes the anther and the filament, right? So whatever tricks you can use that makes sense to you as you memorize this kind of anatomy, I encourage you to use it. It never fails me. These silly little stories I have in my head, I never forget. In this case, the flower anatomy. Of course, the petals, we'll talk a little bit about those too. And then the sepals are what, when you see a closed flower bud, the sepals, they're protecting the actual flower inside. And then, you know, the flower will bud open, the sepals will peel apart, so to speak, and reveal the rest of the flower when it's time. Okay, so basic anatomy. Please know this is just another picture. Here you see a couple of extra terms that you might see in prepared slides or in some of these PowerPoint slides. Gynoecium is one. So instead of saying pistil, sometimes they'll use the word gynoecium. Okay. Androecium is for the male. So you might see those terms too. Those are a little bit more old-fashioned terms, but they often show up. Oh, did it have it here? I forgot to mention receptacle. That's important. Doesn't seem like it would be because it's just the top of the flower stalk. But the receptacle area, that portion of the flower stalk, is often involved in fruit tissue formation. So you do need to know the receptacle. So some fruit is largely composed of receptacle tissue. And we'll get into that when we look at fruits. So please know that word too. You don't need to know the word calyx. I don't really talk about corolla. I use the word petal or petals. Okay. So here the artist looks like they drew 4 ovules on this flower. So just be aware that they use that information for classification of what kind of fruit do we have. I'm not asking you to get to that level of depth. I just want you to appreciate that the ovule design inside the ovary can vary quite a bit, okay? And so here you're just seeing some options, and it depends on the plant species, how many ovules they have, how they place them inside the ovary. So they look at that when they are studying like a brand new plant and trying to figure it out. That's something that they look at and try to use to classify. And you can see they use the same word that they do in, you know, with human reproduction, the placenta, how the ovules are attached to the placenta tissue. And so that's kind of interesting. Here again, just showing different designs. This one I do need you to know. Okay, so this picture, what we're getting at here is where is the ovary with respect to all the other flower parts? And here on the left, you're seeing a superior ovary, which means it sits on top of where the other flower parts come off. All right, and so you can see it sitting right on top. Half inferior, that's pretty self-explanatory, and then inferior. So the rest of the parts come off the top of it. The reason I want you to know this is that as you look at the evolutionary process and you look at ancient flower design versus more recent flower design in the evolutionary timeline, what you see is a pretty distinctive. Ancient flowers tend to be superior ovaries. And then as you work your way along the evolutionary timeline up to current time, the flower design starts to drop where the ovary gets inferior. And they think that in an inferior ovary, it is a better design because it's more protective. So all this other tissue is kind of surrounding the ovary, protecting it. And it's, they think, a more successful strategy. Because of course it's in the ovary that you get the sperm and egg uniting, fertilization, and then the development of the seed. All pretty precious material. Okay, this is a lily flower. On Thursday's lab, you're going to be looking at lily flowers and trying to map out their anatomy. Lily flowers tend to be good ones because they're really big flowers. They're easy to spot all the different parts. It's a perfect flower, male and female structures in both. So this is a nice slide to look at as you do your lab. And so what we're going to do is to learn and visualize what's going on. They tend to pick lilies, the lily plant, for this. And so the slides you're going to look at Thursday in lab, they're all the lily genus. And they mainly do that because the flowers are so big, the ovaries are really big, the ovules are really big, so it's easy to see what's going on. So we'll work through that. And then you'll get to, we'll want you to learn one type of life cycle and a little bit of a second life cycle by when this is all over. Okay, so there's over 250,000 different angiosperms. You only have to learn one example of how they do it. Okay, so all right, we'll stop there and we'll continue on with this on Thursday.